This video was made possible by Dashlane. Stay safe online with Dashlane for free at dashlane.com/Wendover. To stand atop Everest is to have conquered the world. This peak is the roof of Earth, the highest point that exists on this planet, and perhaps no accomplishment ranks higher than climbing Mount Everest. It is considered the achievement of achievements, the upper echelon of what humans can do, and yet Everest is not the hardest mountain in the world to climb. Make no mistake, it is not easy, but even K2, the second highest peak in the world, is fairly universally recognized as more difficult and more dangerous to climb. Far shorter mountains rank more dangerous than Everest. Elsewhere in Nepal, on Annapurna 1, for every 100 people who have reached the summit, 34 have died on its slopes. With only 4 deaths per 100 summiters, Everest, in comparison, could almost be viewed as safe. What makes the difference is that Everest is now a streamlined commercial operation. The majority of those climbing are paying huge amounts to commercial operators who work to give them the best possible chance of reaching the summit. No matter how much you pay, it still takes a huge amount of physical and mental endurance to reach the summit, but for those that have that, Everest has become a logistical problem. What makes the difference between the guides that get all their climbers to the summit with no fatalities and those that don't is how well they plan and strategize. This is, of course, Everest. Reaching an altitude of 29,029 feet, it lays on the border between Nepal and China. While climbers do approach the summit from both sides, the majority choose the Nepalese side. For a few months a year, the Nepalese Everest base camp becomes a veritable tent city. You see, in the winter, winds blast Everest constantly, reaching speeds of 100 miles per hour at the peak, but in the summer, during the monsoon season, huge amounts of snow fall, so there's just this narrow window of time between the two periods when it's safe to summit. With remarkable consistency, this window almost always falls between May 15th and 25th. The routes have to be set, the camps have to be set up, and the climbers have to be acclimatized all before May 15th rolls around, so that means that sometime every year in March, the first Sherpas arrive below Everest to set up base camp. Sherpa is not actually a job title, it's an ethnic group. Sherpa people live in the mountains surrounding Everest and, remarkably, have genetic adaptations including larger lung capacity that helps their bodies perform better at higher altitudes. In addition, having been born and raised in the Himalayas, Sherpas have become some of the most skilled mountaineers in the world, and many of the world's climbing records are held by Sherpas. One Sherpa holds the record as having summited Everest 21 times. Sherpas are therefore hired to do the toughest work on Everest. Each commercial expedition will hire their own group of Sherpas to move supplies and guide climbers. So each March, long before the first climbers or Western guides even land in Nepal, the first Sherpas will arrive at base camp to set up tents for their expedition. Each individual climber typically pays somewhere upwards of $40,000 for their Everest expedition, with some companies charging as much as $130,000. Given that, base camp isn't just any old camp. The more expensive companies will have multi-room tents for each climber, dining tents, an on-site doctor, hot showers, power, and even Wi-Fi. This is home for thousands of people for 2 or 3 months, so it's got to be nice. The rest of the mountain, though, is not as nice. There are a lot of ways to die on Everest. Falls, avalanches, heart attacks, falling ice, and just freezing to death. This is not a hospitable place, but one of the most common killers is acute mountain sickness. This is an umbrella term that includes a number of fatal conditions such as high-altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema. These sicknesses all stem from the fact that there's less oxygen at higher altitudes. While mild altitude sickness can set in at lower levels, it starts to have the potential to be fatal above 11,500 feet, where there is only 65% as much oxygen as there is at sea level. Above 18,000 feet, where there is only 50% the oxygen of sea level, permanent human habitation is impossible due to the certain deterioration in brain and physical function. Above 25,000 feet, it is impossible for humans to acclimatize, and so they can only survive for a matter of hours before their body starts to shut down. Even the best climbers' brain function deteriorates at such a height. It's for this reason that above this altitude on Everest is called the death zone. If a human living at sea level were suddenly transported to the peak of Everest at 29,029 feet, where there's only 33% the oxygen of sea level, they would die within 30 minutes from hypoxia. It is for this reason that nobody can just arrive at Everest and immediately head for the summit. Before that, climbers have to undergo weeks of acclimatization so their body adapts to functioning with less oxygen. In early April, climbers will typically fly to Kathmandu, meet their guide, then fly to Lukla, a small town with no roads in or out, and begin the slow 10-day trek up the valley to Everest Base Camp at 17,500 feet. Soon after base camp is set up by Sherpas, work starts on setting Everest's route. The first bit of this job falls on the Icefall Doctors. This is a group of the most elite and experienced Sherpas on Everest who have the formidable job of setting the route through the Khumbu Icefall. This glacier is characterized by deep crevices, and as an icefall, it moves by up to 4 feet a day. That means that at any moment, a crevice can open up, or a large piece of ice can fall, or an avalanche from the surrounding slopes can be triggered, which makes this section, despite being directly out of base camp, arguably the most dangerous on Everest. While other sections are dangerous if a mistake is made or individuals get sick, the Khumbu Icefall is equal opportunity deadly. It's just up to luck whether people make it through. To traverse the crevices, the Icefall Doctors set a series of ladders and ropes to guide the way up to Camp 1. Working as a Sherpa on Everest is perhaps the most dangerous job in the world, especially because, while paying climbers might pass through the Khumbu Icefall 3 times a season, a Sherpa might pass through upwards of 20 times. In fact, the Sherpa fatality rate is greater than that of a US soldier in Iraq during the Iraq War, 10 times higher to be specific. Meanwhile, they're really not making that much money, at least by Western standards. Nepal is the 25th poorest country in the world and the 3rd poorest in Asia. The average Nepali earns just $835 a year. Meanwhile, in just 3 months of work, an Everest Sherpa can earn more than $5,000, by far the most anyone can earn in the region without a high level of education. It comes at a price though. In 2014, a massive avalanche was triggered in the Khumbu Icefall that killed 16 Sherpas. Then, in 2015, another 11 were killed in the avalanches that followed an earthquake. A majority of the 53 deaths that have occurred on Everest since 2014 have been Nepalese Sherpas, which has led many to question the ethics of rich climbers hiring these poor Sherpas to do the most dangerous work. Many companies and climbers have countered this by creating and supporting foundations to improve education in the region so Sherpas can have better employment opportunities that don't involve the risks of Everest. Nonetheless, work continues. After the route through the Khumbu Icefall is set in late March or early April, the Sherpas will set up Camp 1. Soon after, they'll work their way upwards and set up Camp 2 and 3 along with the routes to them. Meanwhile, after a few days of rest at base camp, in mid-April, climbers will make their way through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1. This is an acclimatization trip for the body to adapt to climbing at high altitude. After an overnight there, climbers will continue through the relatively flat Valley of Silence and reach Camp 2, where they'll generally stay for a few days as its altitude at 21,000 feet makes it perfect for acclimatization. As a rule, the higher the camp, the fewer the amenities, but Camp 2 still offers hot meals. Often during this trip, climbers will climb a portion of the Lhotse face for further acclimatization before returning all the way down to base camp. Meanwhile, Sherpas will continue their work setting the route from Camp 3 to 4. Everything needed at these camps is carried on the backs of Sherpas. While base camp can be supplied by yak, the route to the upper camps is far too tough to be traversed by any animal or vehicle. You can't even supply them by helicopter. Base camp can somewhat reliably be reached by helicopter, but the higher you go, the thinner the air and the less lift helicopters' blades can generate. That means that to fly a helicopter to Camp 1, for example, you really can't carry much weight. Flights to Camp 1 happen semi-regularly for rescues, while flights to Camp 2 are exceedingly rare. It's just too risky for helicopter pilots to fly much above the Khumbu Icefall unless in a dire emergency. Helicopter rescues above Camp 2 are virtually impossible. One pilot has landed on the top of Everest, but he used a powerful helicopter in perfect weather with all but essential equipment stripped out to lower weight. Whether his feat could be repeated with an injured passenger is doubtful given the weight it would add. This is all to say, when it comes to moving equipment and people up and down Everest, expeditions rely completely on human power. Sometime after their first acclimatization trip, each expedition will make a second run up the mountain with a night at Camp 1, 2, and for the first time at Camp 3. Depending on time, some expeditions might make a third acclimatization trip up to Camp 3, but then, when early May arrives, all eyes are on the weather forecast. They're looking for the weather window. Climbers need 5 largely clear and windless days in order to be able to attempt the summit. Once that window appears in the forecast, there begins a mass climber migration upwards. With as many as 800 climbers all trying to summit in the span of 10 days or less, Everest gets busy. Often groups will skip past Camp 1 and spend their first night at Camp 2. From there, they'll make their way up the sheer Lhotse face to Camp 3. After a night's sleep, climbers will place oxygen tanks in their packs and don regulators so they can start breathing bottled oxygen. This extends how long they can survive in the death zone. A select few climbers, though, attempt the summit with no bottled oxygen. Doing this is far more difficult and dangerous, but about 200 people have completed the feat, which some will say is the pure way of climbing, others will say is reckless. Nonetheless, the vast majority of people use bottled oxygen, and it goes fast. One bottle only lasts 4 hours while climbing, and they need reserves, so each climber needs 12 bottles. That means that each expedition needs upwards of 200 bottles of oxygen in Camp 3 and 4, each of which has to be painstakingly carried up by Sherpas. It's a necessity, though, to operate at this commercial scale. On that third day of their climb, expeditions will make their way from Camp 3 to Camp 4. At this very rudimentary camp, climbers will try to eat. While the bottled oxygen reduces the effect of altitude sickness, it does not eliminate it, and a body's digestive system will have almost completely shut down at this altitude. On each day of their climb up to Camp 4, though, they'll have burned almost 10,000 calories, so they need to eat as much as they can to gain energy. The altitude also makes sleeping nearly impossible, but they need to do that too. They'll go to sleep as early as possible because, after a very short night, it's time. Expeditions each try to get going to the summit as early as possible to beat the crowds. With as many as 200 people following the single-file route to the summit each day, the traffic jam up there is immense. And remember, this is the death zone, so these traffic jams literally kill people. People can run out of oxygen, collapse of exhaustion, and die of exposure, all because they can't move fast enough. Groups will therefore leave Camp 4 anytime between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. As the night progresses and dawn nears, they'll continue their ascent, eventually passing the south summit and making their way up to the Hillary Step. This feature is one of the most technically challenging, and with each climber taking 5 or so minutes to complete it, this is a significant bottleneck. From there, though, the summit is in reach, and after making their way across the relatively easy final section, they'll arrive at Everest Peak, and for a brief moment, there will be nobody on Earth standing above them. This is their moment. The one that each of them spent months and tens of thousands of dollars working for. After 30 minutes, though, the moment is over and they'll head down, back to the world. It's become a continuous debate on whether climbing Everest has become too accessible. Local Chinese and Nepalese companies have started offering expeditions for relatively low prices in the 20,000s, which has made Everest more accessible to what some might describe as less experienced climbers. Of the 10 climber deaths in 2016 and 17, 7 were on budget expeditions, while some established operators have never had a climber death after hundreds of summits. On Everest, at least, it seems expensive is safe. Meanwhile, even with the most reputable operators, you can book yourself on an expedition in a matter of minutes provided you have the money. Once you get there, they'll gauge whether you're fit for summiting, but the fact that you can book yourself on a climb up Everest, which has a 4% fatality rate, as easily as you can book a flight, has many worried about the experience of those climbing the tallest mountain in the world. Each additional climber on the mountain makes Everest more dangerous for everyone else, but nonetheless, both China and Nepal issue more and more permits each year as their important sources of revenue. Everest is commercializing, there's no doubt about it. Whether that's good or bad is up to each individual to decide, but with the tallest mountain in the world, paradoxically, making it safer and easier might be making it less safe. Humans are good at a lot of things. The fact that thousands of people have summited Everest proves this. But one thing that we're not good at is remembering complex sequences like this. We're especially not good at remembering dozens of complex sequences. But, unfortunately, if you want to stay safe online, this is what you have to do, since you want complex passwords that are unique to each site you use, so if one gets compromised, the others don't too. If you have Dashlane though, this is easy. Dashlane generates these super secure passwords for you, stores them in one secure place, and autofills them on your devices so it's easier for you. All of that is actually free at dashlane.com/Wendover. If you want all the features they offer, including a VPN to stay safe on public Wi-Fi, syncing across devices, and dark web monitoring to make sure your data isn't being sold, you can upgrade to Premium for 10% off by using the code Wendover at checkout, and you'll be supporting Wendover Productions while you're at it.